The first light of dawn stretched across Boston, but beneath the warm colors of sunrise, the city carried a cold tension. For years, the colonists had lived under British taxation that felt less like law and more like punishment. Every shopkeeper, dockworker, and farmer felt the sting of rules passed in London by people who never set foot on American soil. The Stamp Act had angered them, the Townshend duties frustrated them, but the Tea Act was the spark that touched dry grass. It wasn't just about tea, it was about control. It was about dignity, and Boston had reached its breaking point. Samuel, a young apprentice printer, moved quickly through the narrow streets with a bundle of fresh pamphlets hidden inside his coat. His master had spent all night printing them with a risky message, one that could land them in trouble with the British soldiers patrolling the town. No taxation without representation. Each letter was bold, each word sharpened with emotion. Samuel slipped the pamphlets into taverns, bakeries, meeting halls, any place where hands would grab them and eyes would read them. Soon whispers became arguments, and by noon, the city buzzed like a hive disturbed. At the harbor, the British ships sat heavy in the water, their hulls packed with crates of tea. To the Crown, this tea represented order. To the colonists, it represented chains. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Samuel joined a group of men gathering in hushed clusters. They wore simple disguises, not to hide cowardice but to show unity. Tonight, they weren't merchants or craftsmen, they were something else entirely. With silent determination, they moved toward the ships. Boards creaked under their feet as they climbed on deck. Samuel's heart hammered as he lifted the first crate. The splash it made when it hit the frigid water echoed like a declaration. One by one, hundreds of crates followed, filling the harbor with floating leaves and dark swirling patches. The onlookers, both colonist and British, stood frozen, knowing a line had been crossed that could never be erased. Samuel returned home that night exhausted but electrified. He knew the British government would retaliate, perhaps harsher than ever before. But in the stillness of his small room, he realized something profound. The people had stopped being subjects and started being citizens. A colonial protest had transformed into a revolutionary spark. The Boston Tea Party was more than defiance, it was the opening chapter of a struggle for a nation still unborn. And Samuel could feel in his bones that nothing in America would ever be the same again. The war had dragged on for years, carving scars into every life it touched. What began with protests and pamphlets had grown into a brutal struggle across forests, mountains, and frozen fields. Soldiers who once picked up muskets with trembling hands now marched with the endurance of men who had seen too much to ever return to their old lives. At Yorktown, Virginia, the final act of this long conflict was preparing to unfold. George Washington stood tall, his expression calm yet fueled by unshakable resolve. He knew this siege could break the British will and change history forever. Thomas, a young soldier barely in his 20s, had survived the harshest winters, starvation, disease, and the hopeless nights where victory seemed like a distant dream. He had marched alongside farmers, merchants, boys barely older than children, and men who left their families praying they would return. Now he stood in the trenches, mud clinging to his boots, hands shaking not from fear but from the exhaustion of a war he desperately hoped would end soon. The French forces worked beside the Americans, their presence a sign that the world was watching and helping. Cannons were positioned carefully, trenches dug wide enough for movement, and every soldier waited for the signal. Thomas looked across the enemy lines, seeing glimpses of red uniforms moving behind makeshift defenses. Those men were tired too, trapped with no escape by land or sea. The French fleet had sealed the harbor, cutting off any chance of rescue. When the bombardment began, the sky filled with smoke and thunder. The ground shook from the relentless cannon fire. Thomas loaded weapons, carried ammunition, and watched the British positions crumble piece by piece. Every explosion felt like a step toward freedom but also a reminder of the countless sacrifices made over the years. This wasn't just another battle, it was the turning point. Inside his camp, British General Cornwallis realized the walls were closing in. Supplies dwindled, morale collapsed, and the once mighty British Army faced the reality of defeat. On the morning of October 19, 1781, the British marched out in silence. Their flags were lowered, their drums muted. Thomas stood among hundreds of American and French soldiers as British troops laid down their weapons. He felt a wave of emotion, relief, pride, disbelief. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel dangerous. Washington accepted victory with dignity, refusing to gloat. He knew the war wasn't officially over yet, but the outcome had been sealed. As celebrations spread through the American camp, Thomas gazed toward the horizon, imagining the future, a nation built on the courage of ordinary people who dared to challenge an empire. Yorktown wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the moment America began to breathe as a free nation.